They told the funeral home I was dead, and when I walked in during my own memorial, the first thing I saw was my niece untangling my pearls with a wet finger like they were hers by birthright. I am 81 years old, and if you are picturing a fragile ghost who floats from chair to chair, let me correct you. I climb 2 flights every morning to the little apartment above the bakery, where the smell of butter and yeast rises like a hymn. I water the geranium that refuses to bloom and the basil that refuses to die. I drink coffee from a mug with a chipped rim because I like the way the flaw fits my lip. And when I sit down at the small round table by the window, it is not to weep about what people did to me. It is to count the sparrows on the telephone line and decide what to cook for myself, because I am still here, and I have learned that ordinary choices are a kind of rebellion when the world has tried to file you under finished. The memorial came on a Sunday with a sky the color of dishwater and the kind of wind that sneaks under your coat and tells you the truth. I wore my navy dress that falls just below the knee and the shoes that remember the shape of my feet. And I swear to you, my hands did not tremble, not because I'm brave in the cinematic sense, but because there is a quiet that arrives after a long season of being ignored, a quiet that thickens the air until panic can't push through. I walked up the church steps like a woman going to return a borrowed bowl, a little annoyed, a little amused, and certainly alive. You should know how a woman like me becomes dead while still paying her light bill and answering to her name. It doesn't happen all at once. It begins with small administrations of erasure that taste like courtesy. The nurse who stands at the foot of your hospital bed and asks your daughter if she is in pain. The cashier who looks at the younger person beside you when she says, "Do you want a bag?" The family group text that makes plans in your presence using words like we and later and afterwards. And when you ask what afterwards means, they say, in that gentle voice reserved for the confused and the inconvenient, "Oh, never mind now," as if you were a dog who will be fed some other time. So you begin to move your mouth less and listen more. You learn to swallow tiny stones instead of arguing about them, because arguing at a certain age is called being difficult. And I was raised to be many things, but not difficult, not the woman who makes a scene, not the woman whose anger leaves a ring on the table. On the night the notion of my death took root, I had already been home from the hospital 2 days, the bruise on my hip turning that holy gradient from plum to yellow, and I heated soup I had made and frozen in small blue containers the week before, the spoon tapping the side of the pot in a rhythm I was born to. My son hadn't called. My daughter-in-law had texted a single heart that looked like a sticker you might peel off and throw away. And I turned on the radio to the late program where the host speaks to truckers and night nurses and lonely men in their garages. And I thought, as I rinsed the bowl and set it upside down to dry, that being alive is often just this, putting things right where you can and refusing to answer questions that aim to make you smaller. I did not expect a memorial. I did not expect the obituary that was not an obituary, printed neatly in the church bulletin between a bake sale and a call for volunteers to repaint the nursery. I did not expect to hear my name spoken in the past tense by a minister who had baptized 2 of my grandchildren and once accepted my lemon bars with both hands like a man being handed a blessing. But there it was, my life summarized in 7 sentences and a mispronounced middle name. There was the photograph taken at my 70th, the one where I am wearing a sweater the color of wet sand and holding a cake with sparklers, smiling with my lips and not my eyes, because I had already learned that the camera belongs to those who get to stand in the middle. If you ask how I learned about the service, I will tell you it was a trifling thing. A flyer taped to the window of the corner store by the bus stop, a paper square with black borders and my face in gray, the owner saying, "I'm so sorry for your loss," and I, without thinking, answering, "Thank you," because the reflex to keep others comfortable is stronger than outrage, especially in women who have spent decades pouring coffee and making arrivals easy for everyone but themselves. I took the flyer with me and folded it into my pocket, and when I got home, I smoothed it on the table and read the words again, as if repetition might make them truer. Then I took out the envelope with my discharge papers and my state ID and laid them on top of my own funeral announcement, like two stones on a grave, to keep it from blowing away. I am telling you these textures, these small, stupid textures, the drag of the stapled corner of the flyer against my skin when I slid it out, the way the church door sticks in damp weather, the sour polish on the pews that never really dries, because drama, when it is told properly, is not a parade of crescendos. It is a series of quiet facts that add up to a cliff, and the cliff was this. I had become optional in the story I had written with my labor, and optional people are easy to bury with paperwork. The morning of the service, I ironed a handkerchief, not because I expected tears, but because a pressed square of cotton can keep a person from turning into a spectacle. I pinned my hair with the tortoiseshell comb that still holds fast, though its teeth are tired, and I took the bus because I wanted to enter the room with the speed of my own choosing, not be delivered like an errand by someone who would later say, "We took care of it." The driver nodded at me with that urban politeness that understands dignity is a fragile egg we carry in public, and I sat in the sideways seat near the middle where the motion is least cruel, and I watched other lives tumble on and off, the girl with the lime green backpack biting her thumb, the man with the scar across his knuckles counting his coins, the couple who forgot to stop touching even when they were not being watched. I breathed with them, and when my stop came, I pulled the cord, and the bell made its small, bright noise, and we all went on being mortal together. Now the hook, you say, as if the hook were not already sunk, but here it is again, sharp and honest. They told the funeral home I was dead, and they told themselves I was dead, because a living mother asks questions. A living grandmother notices who is gentle to the baby and who is cruel to the dog. A living matriarch remembers who promised what and when. A living woman might open a drawer and see her jewelry parceled out on index cards with names written in a cheerful hand that pretends kindness. And when I stepped into the fellowship hall and saw the long table draped in white, and beside the coffee urn, the silver trays with my bracelets and brooches, when I watched a girl I love hold my pearls against her throat to measure the fall, when I heard the scrape of the cake knife as someone cut my lemon bars that had been baked by someone else and praised as if the recipe had fallen from the sky, I understood that my death, the one they had rehearsed without my consent, was a practical arrangement masquerading as grief. I was not angry in the way that shatters glass, because anger that breaks things only gives them reason to say you were unbalanced. I was something colder, a lake in November that has decided to keep its secrets until spring. If you are wondering where my voice went in those first minutes, why I did not shout, why I did not strike the table and scatter the rings like coins at a wedding, then you do not yet know the education of women like me, the curriculum of composure taught by mothers who had nothing but pride to give their daughters, who said, "Stand straight and finish your sentence," even when the room turned away. I moved through the aisles like a parishioner late to communion. I nodded at the old men with their stiff collars and the old women with their careful lipstick. I met the minister's eyes and watched his face rearrange itself into recognition and then astonishment, and then the particular administrative dread of a man who realizes the narrative is escaping. I sat. I folded my hands. I placed my bag beside me where a child might lean, and I listened to them speak about me as if I were a dish they had once enjoyed, as if I were an anecdote that belonged to the collective. When I finally stood, the room obliged me with silence, the way a startled animal freezes to learn the shape of the danger, and I said something like, "We can do this again, but properly." And even that sentence, modest as it was, sounded to my ears like a door unlocking in a house where most rooms have been closed for years. I keep circling back to the apartment over the bakery, to the second-hand clock that ticks with stubborn accuracy on the wall, to the neighbor's radio that leaks salsa in the afternoons and old standards at night, because the present is my alibi against the absurdity of their story. A dead woman does not buy flour and eggs and leave a note for herself on the cupboard that says, "Call the dentist." A dead woman does not mend the cuff of her sweater with navy thread and a clean knot on the underside. A dead woman does not stop at the thrift store and run her thumb along the spines of novels until she finds the one with pencil underlines from a stranger who believed the same sentences she does. I catalog these things the way a traveler lays out her documents before a border, not because I doubt my passport, but because I know there is always a person in a little booth who believes he has the power to tell me what country I belong to. On the afternoon after the service, I climbed my stairs slower than usual, a pleasant fatigue in the thighs that reminded me I own this body even when others try to inventory it. And I made tea, the strong kind, the kind that stains the cup and the tongue, and I sat and wrote my name, first and middle and last, in my notebook 10 times, not as if I were practicing, but as if I were signing for my own release. You might think I'm telling you all this to build a lawsuit out of paragraphs, and perhaps there will be papers with signatures and words like fraud and malice and intent. Perhaps there will be a clerk who stamps a date that will one day be important to someone else, but that is not why I'm speaking. I am talking because the worst violence in my life was not performed by strangers or blows. It was performed by the soft, efficient machinery of dismissal, by polite euphemisms that escorted me to the edge of my own story and suggested I step down, and I want another woman, somewhere, to hear the sound of my steps as I refused. I want her to know that the hook in this tale is not the spectacle of a living woman at her own memorial, though I admit the theater of it has a certain acid comedy. The hook is the trick they tried to play with language, calling me past when I had simply been placed, calling me beloved when they could not be bothered to call me at all, and the counterspell is simple and costs nothing. To say your name out loud in a room that pretends not to hear you, to enter, to stand, to speak in a voice that has packed lunches, paid mortgages, held tongues, and outlived the fashions of contempt. And so I begin here, not with my childhood or with the soft focus virtues of my kitchen, though both have their place and both are mine, but with the moment I watched my life laid out like a buffet, with the moment I understood that nothing protects you from becoming a story told by other people except the stubborn act of telling it yourself. I am 81, yes, and my hip aches when the weather changes, and my eyes prefer afternoon light to evening, but my memory is a ledger, and my hands are steady, and I have come back to claim what is not tangible and not transferable, what no probate court can divide, what no daughter-in-law can catalog with a sticky note and a flourish of pen, my breath, my say-so, my ongoing, The catalyst came disguised as a homecoming. When the hospital discharged me, I expected to find my son waiting, leaning on the hood of his car, pretending to check messages so he wouldn't have to look too emotional. I imagined he would open the door, help me sit, tell me he had already warmed up some soup or that the bed was made fresh. Instead, there was no one. The nurse wheeled me to the curb and stood beside me like a polite stranger waiting for a taxi. I remember her frown when she realized no one was coming. "Maybe they're just running late," she said, the way people say it when they already know the truth. She called my son's number 3 times, then handed me the phone. It rang until it stopped. I told her I would take care of it myself, that my family was probably just confused about the time. She pushed my chair back inside and let me wait in the lobby. By dusk, when the janitor began stacking empty coffee cups and the last of the nurses changed shifts, I understood that confusion was just another word for choice. There was a volunteer, a young man with a cast on his arm, who offered to call me a cab. I told him I didn't know where to go. "My house," I said, but even as I spoke, the word tasted uncertain. It had been my house for 47 years, the walls painted 3 times, the garden replanted 5, the same kitchen table polished until the wood gleamed like old honey. Yet after the silence from my children, something in me suspected that home had been quietly moved elsewhere. Still, I gave the driver the address and watched through the window as the city folded into itself, neon and dusk, and the particular melancholy of headlights on wet asphalt. When we reached my street, the house looked smaller, the porch light off, the mailbox gleaming with a new brass nameplate that I could not read from the car. I asked the driver to wait. He hesitated, but I paid him in advance. The key in my bag, my own key, refused to fit the lock. It wasn't a matter of stiffness. It was a new lock entirely, silver and clean, unscarred by the years of my hand. I rang the bell once, twice, then longer. Through the window I saw a movement, a figure, maybe my daughter-in-law, but the curtains closed quickly. The light behind them went out. I stood there long enough for the air to cool around me, for the driver to roll down his window and ask if I was all right. I said yes, because saying no would require too much explanation. I asked him to take me to the church instead, the one on Hillcrest, where my children had been baptized and where I had sung alto in the choir until my breath began to shorten with age. He drove in silence. When I arrived, the church was empty, except for a cleaning woman humming softly and the faint smell of lemon oil. I sat in the back pew, the one near the side door, and tried to think rationally. Maybe they had rented the house. Maybe there was some mistake. Maybe, though I knew better. The cleaning woman noticed me and smiled kindly. "You must be here for tomorrow," she said, pointing to a stack of folded programs on the table. "They're doing a lovely memorial." She picked one up and handed it to me. There was my name printed beneath a cross. "So sorry for your loss," she added before I could speak. I did not faint. I did not scream. I did not tear the paper. I simply read it again, tracing each letter like a seamstress checking her own stitches. Beneath my name were the words, "A life of grace and devotion." There was a photograph, one I recognized, a candid taken at my 75th, the year I still believed in reconciliation. The date of death was 2 days prior, the day I had been lying in a hospital bed, watching the ceiling tiles and waiting for my son's voice. My daughter-in-law's name appeared beneath as loving caretaker. They had planned everything, the hymns, the flowers, the refreshments. The service would be held the following Sunday at 2 p.m. The announcement invited friends and family of the dearly departed to celebrate my passage into eternal rest. I folded the program, put it in my coat pocket, and thanked the cleaning woman. Outside, the night had turned damp, the kind of mist that curls around your ankles and convinces you you're being followed. It would be easy to call that moment betrayal, but the truth is, betrayal had been growing quietly for years, watered by politeness. It was there when my son suggested putting the deed in his name for convenience, when my daughter-in-law reorganized my kitchen and threw out the jars labeled in my handwriting, when they told me that the stairs were too dangerous and that maybe a senior living arrangement would be more practical. I mistook control for care, thought I was being protected when I was merely being erased. The fake death was just the signature on paperwork that had been written in invisible ink long before. Still, seeing it printed, seeing the borders of the program and the cursive font, the sheer finality of it, felt like standing at the edge of my own outline. I took the bus to the police station that night. The young officer at the desk listened with polite bewilderment as I explained that I was, in fact, not deceased. He took my ID, examined it, and called someone in the back. They asked if I had relatives who might confirm my identity. I gave them my son's number, and they left me waiting while they made the call. After 10 minutes, the officer returned, face careful. "He says you must be confused," he told me gently, as if confusion were contagious. He said his mother passed away recently. I could have insisted, demanded fingerprints, medical records, something, but the fatigue that had been hovering for weeks settled suddenly in my bones. I asked for my ID back. The officer handed it to me like a fragile object. "You can stay here until morning if you like," he offered, but the idea of sleeping under fluorescent lights among the lost and the waiting made my stomach turn. I walked out. The night air was sharp and clean, and I walked without knowing where my legs were taking me, past shuttered stores and sleeping houses until I reached the park. The benches glistened with dew. I sat on one and stared at my hands, the knuckles swollen, the veins blue as rivers on a map. The thought that struck me was not outrage, but absurdity. Somewhere, at that very moment, my family was planning refreshments, choosing verses, deciding which photos best represented the woman they had already edited out of their daily lives. I wondered if they would serve the lemon bars I used to make, or if my daughter-in-law had found a store-bought substitute. I laughed then, quietly, because the world had tilted into farce, and laughter was the only thing that kept me from dissolving into something less human. At dawn, I went to a diner that had been open longer than I'd been alive. The waitress didn't ask questions. She poured coffee, left the pot, and called me honey. I spread the program on the counter beside the sugar packets and read it again while the coffee cooled. Beneath the list of hymns, there was a small note. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the family. That was when the shape of their intention revealed itself, in perfect symmetry. They had not only buried me socially, they had monetized the funeral. Insurance claims, inheritance, sympathy, death as a business plan. I laughed again, a sound that startled the man 2 stools away. He looked at me and smiled uncertainly. "Good news?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. The waitress refilled my cup, and I asked if I could keep the mug. She looked confused. "We sell them sometimes," she said. I paid double the price she mentioned, not because I wanted a souvenir, but because I needed proof of transaction, something that said I existed in commerce, in motion, in the world of the living. I wrote my name on a napkin and slipped it into my wallet beside the program. Then I walked to the bus stop again, this time with a strange calm. I had been declared dead, but what they had really done was free me. The following days passed like a dream where every object has the wrong weight. I visited the bank. The teller blinked when I handed her my ID and account number. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said after typing for a long moment. "This account was closed due to the passing of the account holder." The word passing again, so delicate it barely touched the tongue. "I am the account holder," I said. She apologized, called a supervisor, who called another, until the small cluster of them stood around the screen, whispering like archaeologists decoding a forbidden text. Finally, one of them said, "We'll need some time to resolve this." I smiled. "Take all the time you need," I said. "I've got more of it than you think." That evening, I stood in front of the church again, not to argue, but to see it as an object, an address, a stage set for my own disappearance. The bulletin board displayed the schedule for the upcoming week: youth choir practice, a bake sale, and my memorial at 2. A neat little trinity of life, commerce, and death. I thought of calling the minister to cancel, but the impulse faded. Let them gather. Let them cry. Let them decorate tables with photographs and platitudes. I would attend, not as a ghost or a victim, but as an auditor taking notes on the quality of the performance. When I finally returned to my apartment, the one I had leased years before as a kind of quiet refuge, a place to go when family visits became too long, I unlocked the door and turned on the light. Everything was just as I had left it. The small sofa, the faded rug, the jar of sugar on the counter. The air smelled of disuse and lavender. I sat in my old chair and listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the most loyal sound in a world of unreliable voices. The betrayal, I realized, was complete, but it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning, written by someone who had run out of patience for politeness. I made a list that night on the back of the memorial program, not of people to confront, not of revenge to seek, but of things that proved I was alive. My rent receipt, the bruise still fading on my hip, the callus on my finger from writing grocery lists, the sound of my own breathing steady and audible in the quiet room. When I finished, I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the drawer beside my bed. The line between the living and the dead had never seemed thinner, but I was on the side that still remembered how to make a plan. The next Sunday, at precisely 2:00, I would walk through the doors of that church and take my place among the mourners. And when they saw me, when they heard my voice, they would finally have to reckon with the truth that death, like love, is only binding if both parties agree. The first escalation did not happen in one dramatic wave, but in the quiet persistence of strangeness, in the slow realization that the world I thought I belonged to had already been rearranged without my permission. After I left the diner, after the laughter turned into something steadier, almost like resolve, I went about the practical business of being alive. You cannot walk into your own funeral unprepared, I told myself. There were errands to run, confirming my name on the hospital discharge forms, retrieving the copy of my insurance policy from the small fireproof box in my apartment, calling the bank again, and leaving messages in the polite, even voice that old women use when they know that the person on the other end is already dismissing them. Every time I spoke my name, it sounded slightly more substantial, as though it was reattaching itself to me, letter by letter. And yet, the more I insisted on my existence, the more the world conspired to behave as though I were simply a paperwork anomaly. At the post office, the clerk stared at my ID and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Alden, but our records show a forwarding address to an estate executor." The words were bureaucratic, but I heard what he meant. "You are not supposed to be standing here." I smiled and thanked him, because anger would only feed the illusion that I was losing my grip on reality. The truth was simpler and colder. Someone had methodically erased me. It is peculiar, the feeling of being treated as an imposter in your own skin. When I tried to renew my library card, the computer system spat out an error that read, "Deceased." When I called the utilities company to reinstate my account, the young woman on the line said, with genuine sympathy, "That's so strange, ma'am, but the file says the property owner passed away last week. The property owner was me. I had the bills, the receipts, the bruised hands that had cleaned every corner of that house. The woman offered to open a new account in the name of my son to make things easier. I thanked her and hung up before my voice could shake. Each small conversation pressed the same bruise. I had become a ghost with documentation. It wasn't just about papers. It was about language, about how easily the world can turn a person into a memory once the words start lining up that way. Past, departed, late. Those words are polite traps, and I had fallen into one. On Wednesday, I returned to the house again, not because I expected them to welcome me, but because I wanted to see it one last time before the memorial. It was just after noon. The sun made the windows glare like they were defending themselves. My hydrangeas, which had once bloomed so wildly that the neighbors used to steal cuttings, were trimmed down to stumps. A for sale sign leaned against the mailbox. I laughed quietly. They couldn't even wait for the second verse of Amazing Grace. The curtains were open this time. I could see the living room, new furniture, new rug, none of my things. I had left behind an old rocking chair that belonged to my mother, a piece of oak carved by a carpenter who charged a bottle of whiskey instead of money. It was gone. The mantel was bare except for one large photo, my son and his wife on a cruise, the ocean behind them like proof that they had sailed far from obligation. I stood on the sidewalk until a neighbor noticed me. It was Margaret, who used to borrow sugar and bring back gossip in equal measure. She came closer, frowning. "My goodness," she whispered. "I thought—" She didn't finish. I nodded. "You thought right," I said, and she covered her mouth as if I were contagious. I asked her how long the house had been on the market. "Just a week," she said. "Your daughter-in-law told everyone you went peacefully." The word peacefully twisted like wire. I thanked her, wished her well, and left before she could recover her curiosity. That evening, I went through my old address book, a little red notebook that smelled faintly of lemon polish. Most of the numbers were obsolete. People move, die, forget. I found one that wasn't. Carol, a friend from the choir, the kind of friend who never asks for gossip because she already knows the story behind your sighs. I called her, and when she heard my voice, she gasped, "My God, Ruth, what kind of joke is this?" I told her it wasn't a joke. There was a pause, the kind of silence that measures distance. Then she said quietly, "They made it sound so tragic. The fall, the complications, the family at your bedside." I almost laughed again, but there was no humor left. "No complications," I said. "No bedside." Carol began to cry, and I realized she was the first person to mourn me while I was still capable of hearing it. She begged me to come stay with her, but I said no. I needed to stay close. I needed to see it through. She promised to come to the memorial and sit near the back, and I told her not to announce me until I chose to stand. It was the first time I used the word stand as a plan rather than a memory. The days leading up to Sunday had a strange clarity, like the calm before a storm that already knows its path. I woke early, brewed strong tea, and watched the bakery across the street set out trays of rolls. The smell of yeast and sugar was grounding. Life, as it turns out, has a very practical scent. I bought a loaf and exchanged pleasantries with the baker's daughter, who told me her grandmother had just moved in with them. I wished her patience, thinking of the irony that some grandmothers are mourned too soon and others not soon enough. Back home, I laid out my clothes for Sunday, the navy dress, freshly pressed, the coat with deep pockets, and the small leather bag containing every document that proved I existed. I ironed my handkerchief again. There was comfort in repetition. When the iron hissed against the cloth, I thought of all the women who have done the same before, facing a moment they could not yet name. I did not sleep much that night. The mind, when it knows it will have to perform truth in public, begins rehearsing without permission. I imagine the church, the flowers, the faces. I imagine my son standing near the pulpit, his hand on my daughter-in-law's shoulder, his eyes trained on the minister, performing grief with the skill of a man who has long practiced sincerity without conviction. I wondered if he would cry, or if he would simply lower his head at the appropriate time. I tried to picture the grandchildren. The youngest would not remember me beyond the shape of my glasses and the smell of cinnamon that followed me everywhere. The oldest might suspect something, the way perceptive children do when the adults around them are too careful. I hoped he would see me before anyone else, so that my resurrection might first appear to a pair of honest eyes. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of light that makes even living things look pale. I dressed slowly, fastening each button with deliberate precision. When you have been declared dead, every small action becomes ceremonial. I looked at myself in the mirror and almost laughed again, not at the absurdity, but at the unmistakable pulse in my throat. There is a kind of defiance in the elderly that no one teaches you. It grows in the space between being patronized and being pitied. I wrapped my scarf and stepped outside. The city was waking up, people carrying flowers, grocery bags, lives. On the bus, no one looked at me twice. The young man across the aisle was humming softly through his earbuds, and I thought, if the dead ride buses, they must sit like this, quiet, unnoticed, almost free. When I reached the church, the parking lot was full. I stood across the street for a long minute, watching people arrive in their dark clothes, holding umbrellas, greeting each other with solemn half-smiles. The air smelled of lilies and rain. From where I stood, I could see through the stained glass, the flicker of candles, the shadow of movement. I felt a tremor, not of fear, but of recognition. This was my own threshold, the border between the fiction they had written and the life I was about to reclaim. I waited until the first hymn began before crossing the street. The ushers at the door didn't recognize me. Perhaps the photograph on the program had aged me into someone unidentifiable. I slipped into the last pew. The minister was speaking about endurance and faith, about how I had lived a life of gentle generosity. The words washed over me like warm water. I scanned the rows until I saw my son, standing straight, hands clasped, the perfect widower's son, and beside him, my daughter-in-law, face arranged in a sorrow that could have been printed. On the side table near the pulpit stood the display of my jewelry, my rings on a velvet pad, my necklaces draped across a lace cloth. It was almost artistic, the arrangement of theft. I stayed seated through the readings and the songs, through the photo montage projected on the wall, through the polite sniffles of people who probably hadn't spoken to me in years. At some point, I realized I was not sad anymore. There was an odd peace in watching your absence so carefully choreographed. It teaches you how replaceable affection can be, how little a person needs to vanish before convenience rewrites memory. When the minister invited anyone to share a few words, there was a pause. I stood. My knees did not tremble. The sound of the wooden pew creaking drew every head in the room toward me. My son's mouth opened, then closed. My daughter-in-law's hand flew to her chest. I walked down the aisle slowly, each step erasing a sentence from their script. The murmur that followed me was low and spreading, like the beginning of a storm. When I reached the front, I turned to face them all and said, "We can continue this, but you'll have to let me breathe while you do." A ripple went through the crowd. A collective exhale caught halfway. The minister dropped his notes. Someone in the back whispered, "It's a miracle." I wanted to tell them it was only paperwork undone, but I let the moment hang. That was the escalation, not the confrontation itself, but the decision to enter the room and make silence answer for me. It was the first act of rebellion that required no shouting, no tears, just presence. The church smelled of wax and flowers, and I could hear my own heartbeat in the pause that followed. My son took a step forward, his voice barely steady. "Mother," he said, as though testing a word he no longer owned. I nodded. "You might want to sit," I replied. And with that, the world shifted again, small and seismic, the first tremor of a reckoning that no one in that sanctuary was prepared to survive with their dignity intact. The midpoint began in silence, the heavy, deliberate kind of silence that follows an explosion you can't yet see the smoke from. When I finished speaking at the memorial, no one moved. The minister's mouth opened and closed twice before he remembered to breathe. My son's hand twitched toward me, then dropped. My daughter-in-law let out a small cry that was half surprise and half irritation, as though I had ruined an event she had spent weeks organizing. I stood at the front of the church, the hymns still open on the lectern behind me, and realized that I was the only living thing in a room full of people pretending to grieve. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was a strange, cold clarity, like air after rain. I looked at my own photograph on the table, the same face, softer around the eyes, caught mid-smile, and thought how easy it is for an image to replace a person. I said quietly, "I'd like my jewelry back," and reached for the velvet tray. The small sounds of metal against metal filled the space where words had failed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply gathered what was mine, piece by piece, and placed it into my bag while they watched, too stunned to intervene. Then I turned, nodded to the minister, and walked back down the aisle. The only sound was the slow tap of my shoes on the stone floor, the same measured rhythm I used to keep when leading the choir decades ago. Outside, the light had shifted to that thin, forgiving gold of late afternoon, and I breathed it in like proof that the world was still capable of honesty. I sat on the church steps for a long time. The lilies arranged by the door had already begun to droop, their scent too sweet, like apology that lingers after it's no longer wanted. Behind me I could hear the confused murmurs, voices trying to rewrite the story before it reached the parking lot, before it became gossip that couldn't be controlled. My son finally appeared at the top of the stairs. His tie was loose, his face pale. "Mother, please," he began, and stopped, because there was nothing polite left to attach to that word. I waited for an explanation, something that would make sense of the cruelty, but what came out was a rehearsed line. "We thought you'd passed." I almost smiled. "And when exactly did you think that?" I asked. He swallowed. "There was a call from the hospital. They said you'd gone in the night. We made arrangements." The words stumbled over themselves, thin and unbelievable. "Did it occur to you to check?" I said. "To come see the body you buried?" He looked at the ground like a boy caught in a lie too large for his imagination. My daughter-in-law appeared behind him, mascara streaked, her grief shifting into anger. "You don't understand," she said. "We were in shock. We didn't know what to do." I could have shouted, demanded to know how one mistakes bureaucracy for death, but I had no energy for their theater. "You did what you always do," I said softly. "You found a version of the story that didn't require my consent." Then I stood, adjusted my coat, and walked past them to the sidewalk. They didn't follow. I think they were waiting for me to collapse, to faint, to become manageable again. I didn't. The walk home was long, the air sharp and bright. Every step felt like an act of reclamation. I was alive, undeniably, inconveniently alive, and that fact alone was enough to throw their carefully built narrative into ruin. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it until my breathing steadied. The bag with the jewelry sat heavy on the table. I poured myself a glass of water, drank it slowly, and looked around the room. It wasn't much: a single window, a small stove, an armchair that creaked, but it was mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. The adrenaline from the day still thrummed beneath my skin. Around midnight, I lit the small lamp by the window and began to write. I wrote down everything: the hospital discharge, the cab ride, the locked house, the funeral program, the faces at the church. Not because I thought anyone would believe me, but because putting it on paper made it undeniable. I wrote until dawn, until my fingers cramped, until the story stopped feeling like a nightmare and started feeling like a record. The next morning, I opened the window and let in the cold air. Below, the bakery was already alive, the smell of bread rising through the street like forgiveness. I went downstairs, bought a roll, and stood by the counter eating it, while the baker, a stout woman with flour in her hair, chatted about her son's engagement. I listened, nodded, and realized with a kind of wonder that the world was going on exactly as before. My death had mattered only within the small, selfish circle of my family. Beyond that, I had not vanished. It was humbling and freeing at once. Back upstairs, I made tea and took the jewelry from my bag. Some pieces were tangled, others scratched. Among them was a small locket my late husband had given me the year our son was born. Inside was a photo of the three of us, me holding the baby, his father's arm around us both. The hinge was slightly bent. I pressed it shut and felt the click reverberate like a verdict. I placed it on the windowsill, where the morning light caught its surface. Then, almost without thinking, I gathered the rest of the pieces, the rings, the bracelets, the brooches, and put them into an old tin box. I wasn't ready to decide what to do with them, but I knew I would not wear them again. They had become evidence, and evidence carries weight. By afternoon, word had spread. Carol called first, breathless. "Ruth, the whole town is talking. They say you walked in like a ghost." I laughed softly. "A ghost with paperwork," I corrected. She wanted to know what I would do next. I told her I hadn't decided. "Whatever it is," she said, "make it count." After we hung up, I sat at my table and stared at the wall. Making it count, that was the challenge. My son would try to contain the story, to paint it as misunderstanding, perhaps even to suggest that I was confused. He had always underestimated my capacity for precision. I began to make another list, this one not of proof, but of possibilities. Find a lawyer, reopen my bank account, change my will, write to the insurance company, contact the local newspaper. Each task was a step away from victimhood and toward autonomy. I didn't feel vengeful. What I felt was older, cleaner, the determination to stop being a background character in my own existence. The following week unfolded in a rhythm of small awakenings. I went to the bank again, this time with the hospital documentation and the newspaper clipping of my supposed obituary. The manager, an older man with kind eyes, read the papers twice before shaking his head. "This is unbelievable," he murmured. "We'll fix it." It took 2 hours, signatures, and multiple phone calls, but when I walked out with a new bank card, I felt a quiet pulse of triumph. At the grocery store, I used it for the first time. Milk, tea, apples, a packet of seeds I didn't need but wanted anyway. The clerk handed me the receipt and said, "Have a good day, ma'am," and I almost laughed because it was the most normal sentence I had heard in weeks. Normalcy, I realized, was the truest resurrection. That evening, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights blink on one by one. The bakery girl was closing up, dragging the heavy shutters down. A boy on a bicycle rode past, singing to himself. The world had no idea that a woman had come back from her own funeral and was now sitting in the dim light, counting her change. The thought comforted me. Not everything had to be grand. Sometimes the revolution is as simple as breathing without asking permission. I took out the tin box of jewelry, opened it, and looked at the contents. One by one, I held each piece in my hand, remembering where it came from, a birthday, an anniversary, a promise. When I reached the locket again, I knew what to do. I kept it. The rest I packed carefully in tissue and placed in a paper bag. The next morning, I took it to the women's shelter 3 blocks away and handed it to the director. "These belong to a woman who forgot her worth for a while," I said. "Maybe they can help someone remember theirs." She looked at me curiously, but didn't ask questions. I left feeling lighter than I had in years. That was the shift, the midpoint, the moment the story stopped being about survival and started being about reclamation. It wasn't about humiliating them or proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. I was alive, and that fact carried responsibilities. I found a lawyer, young, efficient, too eager to be polite, and explained everything. He blinked in disbelief, then nodded gravely. "We can file for identity fraud and elder exploitation," he said. "Do you want to press charges?" I thought about it, imagined courtrooms and testimonies, imagined my son's face twisting between shame and defensiveness. "No," I said finally. "I just want the record to show that I am here." He smiled, half relieved. "That's a start." And it was. When I left his office, the city smelled of rain and exhaust, alive with the sound of people going somewhere. I walked slowly, savoring the anonymity. No one looked twice at me. No one saw a miracle or a headline. They saw a woman in a coat, carrying her bag, moving through the ordinary world. That was the truest form of resurrection. I caught my reflection in a shop window and stopped. For the first time in years, I didn't look like someone waiting to be invited back into her own life. I looked like someone who had already arrived. The second escalation came quietly, like mold spreading under wallpaper, invisible until the smell gives it away. After the church and the first small victories, the reinstated bank account, the visit to the lawyer, the slow return of my name to systems that had already deleted it, I thought the storm was passing. I allowed myself a few mornings of calm, baking bread in the small oven upstairs from the bakery, letting the scent of yeast and sugar rise through the air like a prayer that didn't ask for anything. I even began to think, foolishly, that I could close the chapter and move forward without further intrusion. But cruelty, when it is born from guilt, rarely retreats. It festers, then disguises itself as reconciliation. My son called one evening. His number appeared on my phone like a ghost in daylight, and for a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity, that stubborn twin of forgiveness, pressed my finger to the screen. He spoke softly, almost rehearsed, the tone of a man trying to build a bridge he secretly hopes will collapse before he reaches the middle. "Mother," he said, "we need to talk." The simplicity of it was insulting. We had already talked, at the church, in front of God and everyone. But I said yes, of course, because mothers are trained to agree to conversations even when they know they are invitations to a trap. We arranged to meet at a cafe 2 blocks from my old house. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table, hands clasped around a cup he wasn't drinking from. He stood when he saw me, a reflex from another life. Up close he looked smaller, paler, as though grief, real or fabricated, had carved away at his confidence. He began with apologies, strings of words that dissolved the moment they left his mouth. "It was all a misunderstanding," he said. "We thought you were gone, and we just handled things the only way we knew how." I asked if handling things included selling my house, closing my accounts, and distributing my possessions like party favors. He flinched. "We didn't sell the house," he said quickly. "We only listed it." Nothing was finalized. His wife, he explained, had panicked, had made phone calls she shouldn't have. He said it as though panic were a valid substitute for morality. I listened, stirring my tea though it was already cold, and realized that his apology wasn't meant for me. It was a speech for himself, a narrative patch to cover the gaping hole where empathy should have been. When he finally paused, I said, "You told the world I was dead. You let them pray over me." He rubbed his temple. "It wasn't like that," he murmured. "You have to understand. We thought we were doing what was best." I laughed then, softly but without humor. "For whom?" I asked. He didn't answer. The conversation ended there, not with a reconciliation, but with exhaustion. As I stood to leave, he reached for my hand. "Can we start over?" he said. His touch was light, almost pleading. I withdrew my hand and replied, "You can start wherever you like, but I've already moved on." His face hardened. The tone shifted. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. And there it was, the old voice, the one that expected obedience disguised as reason. I nodded once and walked out, the bell above the door ringing like punctuation. In the days that followed, small things began to happen that carried the scent of warning. My mailbox filled with anonymous letters, blank envelopes containing photocopies of the obituary notice, underlined words, phrases like "rest in peace" scrawled in red ink. Once, a man knocked on my apartment door, claiming to be from the utility company. When I asked for identification, he left without a word. The bakery owner downstairs told me someone had been asking questions about me, a relative wanting to confirm I lived there. Fear tried to creep in, but I had learned that fear is a kind of hunger, and if you don't feed it, it weakens. I made copies of every letter and took them to my lawyer. He frowned, promised to look into it, and advised me to change the locks. I smiled and told him I already had. The next Sunday, I decided to go back to the church, not for service, but for the quiet that lives in empty sanctuaries. I found the minister sweeping the aisle, looking older, his eyes cautious. When he saw me, he froze. "Mrs. Alden," he said, his voice small. I didn't expect. I finished his sentence. "The dead to visit?" He flushed. "I'm so sorry for what happened. I don't know how the family—" "They lied," I said simply. "And you believed them. He looked down at the broom, then at me, and nodded. Would you like to speak to the congregation? To clear things up? The suggestion made me smile. No, I said. They'll learn the truth in their own time. I don't owe them a performance. He seemed relieved. Before I left, he pressed a small envelope into my hand. This was left for you, he said. Inside was a photograph of my jewelry on the table at the memorial, each piece tagged with my grandchildren's names. On the back, written in my daughter-in-law's careful hand, were the words, "We thought you'd want them to have something to remember you by." I stared at it for a long time before folding it neatly and sliding it back into the envelope. I didn't tear it. Rage that clean deserves to be preserved. It was around this time that my granddaughter, the eldest, Emily, found me. She came to my apartment one rainy afternoon, dripping from the downpour, her eyes red from crying. "Grandma," she said, "I knew it wasn't true." She stepped into my arms, and for the first time since the ordeal began, I felt the kind of affection that doesn't need to justify itself. We sat at my small table while she told me how she had overheard her parents arguing the night after my death, her mother shouting that they should have waited, that someone would find out. "I wanted to call you," she said, "but Mom took my phone." The betrayal cut deeper, hearing it from her, because innocence, when it confirms your suspicions, feels like salt in an old wound. I made her tea, and we sat until the rain stopped. She promised to visit again. Before she left, she said something I still carry. "You're the only one in this family who doesn't pretend." It was meant as comfort, but it landed like an epitaph for all of them. A week later, a letter arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize. It was addressed to the estate of Ruth Alden. Inside was a formal notice regarding the sale of my house, finalized in absentia with forged signatures. My son's name appeared twice, once as executor, once as beneficiary. The paper smelled faintly of toner and arrogance. I took it to my lawyer, who read it twice and sighed. "This is serious," he said. "They've committed full-on fraud." I nodded. "Then let's make it serious for them, too." We filed the case the next day. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about principle, about dragging their deceit into the sunlight where it couldn't hide behind grief. News travels fast in small towns. Within a week, whispers began to crawl through the community. At the grocery store, people who had avoided my eyes before now stared openly, their curiosity unfiltered. "Is it true?" they asked in lowered voices. "Are you really suing your own son?" I smiled each time and replied, "No, I'm suing the man who stole from me. My son has yet to appear." The distinction confused them, but truth often does. My daughter-in-law sent an email, long and dramatic, begging me to stop, to think of the family, to avoid humiliating them. I wrote back one sentence, "You already did that." The lawsuit triggered a reaction I hadn't anticipated. My son began leaving messages again, alternating between pleading and threatening. "You don't know what you're doing," he said in one. "You're ruining everything." In another, his voice broke. "I made a mistake, Mom. Please." I didn't respond. The silence between us grew thick, not empty, but alive, filled with all the words we had avoided for years. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my apartment door. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath. After a few seconds, an envelope slid through the gap beneath the door. I waited until the sound faded before picking it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "End this before it ends you." The handwriting was unfamiliar. I didn't call the police. There was nothing they could do but file a report. Instead, I taped the note inside my cupboard where I could see it every morning. Let it be a reminder that even cowards try to sound powerful when their lies are unraveling. When the court date finally came, I dressed carefully. The navy dress again, it had become my armor, and a strand of the same pearls they once divided like spoils. I walked into the courtroom with my lawyer beside me and took my seat. My son and his wife sat opposite, their faces tight with rehearsed contrition. The judge, a woman younger than my youngest grandson, read through the documents with practiced boredom until she reached the forged death certificate. Then her expression changed. She looked at me, then at them. "Mrs. Alden," she said, "I am truly sorry you've had to endure this." Her sympathy wasn't sentimental. It was professional, clean, the kind that restores balance rather than pity. My son tried to speak, something about confusion and paperwork, but she silenced him with a raised hand. "You signed this," she said. "You certified your own mother's death. Do you understand the gravity of that?" He stared at the floor. The gavel struck once, and the sound was like thunder wrapped in justice. The court ruled in my favor: restitution, ownership reinstated, and criminal charges pending. But the real victory was quieter, watching their faces crumble under the weight of being seen. After the hearing, reporters tried to follow me. I waved them off. I had no interest in becoming a headline. Woman declared dead Sue's family would make good copy, but I wasn't a spectacle. I was a woman who had outlived her erasure. That night, back in my apartment, I opened the window wide and let the cool air wash through the room. The bakery downstairs was closing, the smell of warm bread rising like a benediction. I brewed tea, added honey, and for the first time in months, allowed myself to exhale without calculation. I thought about the phrase, "End this before it ends you," and realized they were right, just not in the way they intended. I had ended it, ended the cycle of silence, of maternal indulgence masquerading as love, of being diminished by the very people I had created. The following morning, my granddaughter returned. She brought a small potted plant, a basil sprout, green and defiant. "For your window," she said. We drank tea together. She told me that her parents were furious, that the family group chat was full of blame. "They say you embarrassed them," she said. I smiled. "Good," I said. "It's about time someone did." She laughed, then grew serious. "Are you okay?" she asked. I looked at her, at the earnestness in her young face, and felt something unclench inside me. "Yes," I said, "I am now." That night, after she left, I walked to the kitchen, opened the tin box where I had kept the letters and documents, and took out the photograph from the minister, the one with my jewelry arranged like an exhibit. I held it over the gas flame until it curled and blackened, the ashes falling neatly into the sink. Then I took the melted locket from the windowsill, now just a small warped piece of metal, and set it beside the basil plant, the past and the present, side by side. I whispered, not a prayer, but a declaration. You can't kill what refuses to be silent. The room was still. Outside, the city hummed with its ordinary music, and I realized that the escalation had ended not in chaos, but in clarity. They had tried to bury me twice, once in fiction, once in fear, and both times I had clawed my way back to the surface. What they didn't understand, what perhaps they never will, is that death is only permanent for those who have nothing left to say. I still had pages of breath to spend. The climax did not arrive with sirens or headlines. It came as the kind of morning that looks ordinary to everyone else and feels like a hinge to the person who has decided to turn. I woke before the bakery switched on the mixers, when the street was still holding its breath, and sat at the little table by the window with the stack of documents I had been nursing like a convalescent. The court order voiding the forged death certificate, the reinstatement of my accounts, the judgment restoring title to my house, and the thin, almost shy letter from the district attorney stating that further action against my son and his wife was under review. I laid each page in a neat row, as if setting a table for a feast of facts, and I understood, with a calm that felt earned, that paper could be both scaffold and blade. There is power in a signature when the hand that writes it is finally done, asking permission. I dressed in the navy dress and buttoned the top button with the steadiness of someone who intends to finish what she has started. Then I put the whole stack in my bag and left the apartment, moving slowly down the stairs so the decision could settle into my bones the way heat settles into cast iron. My first stop was the funeral home, the place whose receptionist had addressed me as dear on the phone when I called after the memorial to ask whether my supposed remains had been handled to the family's satisfaction. The building was painted the soft beige of professional regret. Inside, the carpet swallowed footsteps, and the air smelled faintly of lilies and furniture polish. The director appeared with a practiced sorrow on his face that faltered when recognition tugged at it. I did not raise my voice. I placed the court order and the canceled certificate on his mahogany desk and told him that his establishment would draft and publish, at its own expense, a statement of correction in the same venues where it had placed my death notice, and that the statement would be as large and as prominent as the original, using my living name in bold, undoing in print what they had been so efficient at performing. He tried to explain the confusion, to assign responsibility to the family that had paid for the service, to suggest that his business was merely a conduit for private grief. But I reminded him that industry built on ritual must answer to the truth of those rituals, and that the dead deserve better than clerical indifference, especially when they refuse to be dead. He read the order again, the color returning to his face like a concession, and he agreed. Before I left, I asked for the ledger where my file had been kept. I watched him cross out the word deceased and write rescinded in a careful hand, and the sight of that line, literal and black, felt like a vein opening to let an infection drain. From there, I walked to the recorder of deeds. The clerk was brisk and efficient, the kind of woman who recognizes resolve across a counter and answers it with her own. She pulled up my parcel number and showed me, without drama, the sequence of filings, my original title, the forged transfer, the reinstatement after the court's ruling. "We can flag the file," she said, "so any future change requires in-person verification by you." I nodded, and then said the thing I had not expected to say until the words arrived, whole and correct, that I would be deeding the house, free of lien and sentiment, to a local foundation that operates transitional housing for women who have been shoved to the edge of the map by families who want the illusion of caring without the work. The clerk blinked once and smiled the smallest, truest smile I have ever seen across a government desk. She printed what needed printing. I signed what needed signing. With each flourish of ink, I felt space open in my chest that had been clamped shut for years, the pressure loosening as obligation lifted its weight. It was not revenge. It was a reallocation of gravity. I did not tell anyone where I was going next because explanations dilute courage. The foundation office was in a converted school, sunlight slanting across old chalkboards as if ideas were still trying to be written there. The director, a woman with the kind of tired eyes that learned to brighten for other people's sake, invited me to sit. I opened my bag, spread the documents like cards, and told her the whole story in the same even tone I would use to read a recipe. The hospital discharge into a silence that had been rehearsed as grief, the obituary printed with efficient borders, the memorial I attended while my bracelets shone like bait on the velvet by the pulpit, the courtroom where the judge's voice collected what remained of the truth and set it back on its feet. Then I told her the part that mattered, that a house is only a home if it refuses to be used as collateral against a woman's worth, and that mine would not hold the echo of a lie another day. We drew up the papers. She said there would be a plaque. I said names are for tombstones and utility bills, not for gifts you mean with your whole life. If there must be any engraving, let it be on the minds of the women who walk through the door and find a bed that isn't conditional. She cried. I did not. I had cried out everything but resolve. On my way back, I stopped at the newspaper, the little office where the community rag is edited by a man who still smells faintly of darkroom chemicals, as if history clings to him. I asked to speak off the record, and on the record, both at once, and he agreed in that measured way small-town editors do when they suspect they are near a story that might require courage from people who have practiced caution. I laid out the timeline, provided copies of the orders, declined to sensationalize the family, and requested a correction to the notice, not a profile, not an expose, just a clean paragraph that said the earlier report was false and that I was very much alive, doing what living people do, cooking, paying rent, petitioning agencies, redirecting property, buying basil that might live if the window cooperated. He asked whether I wished to be photographed. I said yes, but on my terms. He took my picture on the sidewalk outside. No soft focus, no sentimental angle. A straight-on portrait of a woman who has declined to leave before she is finished. When I reached my apartment, my granddaughter was waiting on the stoop, a book tucked under her arm, the way some people carry umbrellas for luck. We went upstairs, and I brewed the good tea, the kind I had hidden for visits that never happened. I told her what I had done with the house, and she looked at me the way people look at sunsets and verdicts. She asked if I was angry. I told her that anger is a solvent that eats the container if you store it too long, and that I had decanted mine into action before it ruined me. She asked if there was anything she could do, and I said yes. She could stop apologizing for other people's choices and start building a life that does not depend on anyone's permission to be honest. She laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was a relief to hear instructions that did not require disowning herself. The final act of the day was both bureaucratic and sacramental. I took the streetcar to the office where they issue licenses and demanded a new photograph, not because mine had expired, but because the old one was taken in a season when I thought smallness made me safer. The clerk pointed to a sign that said, "Replacements require a fee and a reason." I slid the court order across the counter and said, "The state pronounced me dead on paper. I want a picture that looks like the woman who fixed that." She waived the fee. The flash went off, and I remembered to lift my chin, not out of vanity, but out of respect for the vertebrae that have held up my head through decades of weather. When the card slid warm from the printer, I studied it as though it were a passport to a country I had just founded. On the way home, I stopped by the bank one last time and rented a safe deposit box, not to hoard jewels, but to keep the thin stack of papers that form, when read together, an autobiography written in statutes and stamps. I placed the new license inside for a breath, closed the little door, and opened it again, the way you do when you are teaching a muscle the choreography of certainty. That night, my lawyer called to say the district attorney would pursue charges, that there would be hearings, and in time, a sentencing if the law kept its feet under it. I listened and thanked him, and felt, to my surprise, neither vindication nor dread. The irreversible thing had already happened, and it did not require a courtroom to certify it. I had stepped out of the role I had been assigned and into the one I had written. I had made choices that closed doors behind me with the satisfying thud of finality, the public correction of my death, the transfer of the house, the refusal to let my story be told by people who prefer me quiet. I stood at the window and watched the bakery girl lock the door, the metal grate rattling down like a curtain. In the sink, a cup waited to be washed. On the table, the basil threw a serious little shadow across the wood. I took the photograph from the newspaper's proofs, the one the editor had given me as a courtesy, and taped it inside the cupboard where the threatening note had once hung. Over it I wrote, in a hand that has iced cakes and signed affidavits with equal care, alive, underlined once, not for drama, but for accuracy. Before bed, I opened the tin box where I keep the artifacts of this strange season, the memorial program, the canceled death certificate with its official seal, now meaning nothing, the deposition notice, the little envelope from the funeral home, confirming that the correction would run above the fold. I added one more thing, a note addressed to no one and to myself that said, "The opposite of erasure is not fame, it is presence." I put out the light. Sleep came quickly, not the stunned collapse of the exhausted, but the heavy restorative sleep that visits people who have done the thing that could not be undone. In the morning, when the mixers started below and the street took its first breath, I woke without calculation. The world had not changed, not in a way a stranger could see, but the axis on which I turn had clicked into its rightful groove. I had made an ending, and therefore I had made a beginning that belonged to me. The resolution came, as all true resolutions do, not with applause or confession, but with the slow settling of air after a storm that has already chosen what to leave standing. In the weeks that followed the court's decision and the quiet printing of the retraction, the noise around me thinned. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid my gaze now nodded with the tentative friendliness reserved for survivors of something they do not wish to name. The bakery beneath my apartment hung a new sign, "Bread lives here," and I like to think the universe had a sense of humor left after everything. The rhythm of my days steadied itself into something almost musical. Tea at dawn, letters answered in the afternoon, the scent of flour and sugar climbing the stairs as a kind of benediction. I could feel the body returning to its own tempo, no longer marching to the beat of defense or dread. My name, when I wrote it on bills or prescriptions, no longer looked like a word pulled back from extinction. It looked like something in bloom. I began visiting the house that now belonged to the foundation, walking through the rooms that had once been haunted by my absence. The walls had been painted a soft, pale yellow, the kind that makes sunlight gentler. There were beds neatly made, fresh linens folded on shelves, a few photographs of women planting herbs in the garden that had once been my pride. The hydrangeas were growing again. Someone had read my old notes on pruning, probably found in a drawer. I touched the leaves and felt, for the first time, gratitude for the transformation that had required my disappearance. The women who lived there now, each carrying her own story of neglect, each rebuilding herself in small daily ways, would sit with me on the porch sometimes and talk. They didn't treat me like a benefactor. They treated me like one of them, a woman who had had to teach herself the delicate art of continuing. One of them, a former nurse named Lydia, said, "You know, they only pretend we're gone when we get quiet." I smiled and said, "Then we'll just have to keep talking." It became our little vow, half joke, half manifesto. My granddaughter continued to visit on Sundays. We started baking together in my small kitchen, our laughter filling the room with something sturdier than forgiveness. She had left her parents' house, found a job at the library, and was saving for her own apartment. Sometimes she brought her friends, young women who listened with wide eyes when I told stories about the years before smartphones and shortcuts. I never told them the whole ordeal in detail. Instead, I spoke of presence, of how women disappear not through death, but through the quiet corrosion of disbelief. "You must never apologize for being awake," I told them once, stirring sugar into the tea. "The world will call you difficult for it, but difficulty is only the name they give to resistance." They wrote the words down as though they were studying for an exam in survival. Watching them, I felt the odd sensation of witnessing my own voice echo forward into people I would never have time to meet. That, I realized, was the opposite of dying. When the letter from the district attorney arrived, confirming that the case against my son and his wife had been closed with a plea and a fine, I felt no victory, no vindication, only a deep fatigue that belonged to another kind of ending. They would move away, I was told, start over somewhere else, carrying their guilt like luggage with a broken handle. I did not want to see them again. Forgiveness, I had learned, is sometimes just the refusal to return to the scene. That evening, I wrote their names on a small piece of paper, folded it 3 times, and dropped it into the flame of my gas stove. The fire licked it into black curls that drifted upward and vanished. The act was not theatrical. It was administrative, the closing of an account that had long been overdrawn. Afterward, I opened the window, let the night air enter, and whispered the simplest sentence I had ever spoken: "Enough." The room seemed to agree. Life has a way of shrinking and expanding according to the honesty with which you inhabit it. Mine had become smaller, yes, a single room, a narrow kitchen, a modest income, but it was also wider, stretched by meaning that could breathe without permission. I began keeping a notebook again, not for record, but for clarity. Each day I wrote 1 sentence about what I had noticed. Some were trivial: "The basil has doubled in height," or "Rain on the tin roof sounds like applause." Others were more stubborn: "I am learning the difference between peace and silence." By the time the notebook was half full, I realized I had written myself into a new kind of existence, one that required neither validation nor revenge. I even wrote a letter to Carol, my friend from the choir, thanking her for believing me when belief was expensive. She came to visit soon after, and we sang together for the first time in years, our old voices fragile but still in tune. We laughed when we forgot the lyrics, which was most of the time, but the laughter itself felt like the right refrain. Autumn crept in quietly. The air grew sharper. The bakery switched from fruit tarts to pumpkin loaves, and the evenings began to arrive earlier, like guests who couldn't wait any longer. I spent those dusks sitting by the window, knitting a scarf for my granddaughter, the yarn sliding between my fingers like a slow confession. Across the street, children rode their bikes through puddles, shouting to each other in the kind of joy that doesn't know its own worth yet. Sometimes I thought about the funeral, my own, that absurd play they had staged, and wondered if anyone still spoke of it. Probably not. Memory has the half-life of gossip. What lasts longer is the rumor of resilience, the story people tell about the woman who refused to stay buried. It pleases me to think of it circulating quietly, changing shape, inspiring exaggerations that make me stronger in each retelling. There are worse fates than to be remembered as inconvenient to forget. One Sunday, I baked a pie and carried it to the women at the foundation house. On the crust, with thin strips of dough, I shaped the words, "Still here." They laughed when they saw it, and one of them said, "That's not a message, that's a declaration." We ate the pie on the porch, the sun soft on our faces, the hydrangeas nodding in the wind like they understood. When the plates were empty, I looked at them, these women who had found refuge in the rooms where I had once been erased, and felt the quiet symmetry of survival. It does not roar, it hums, like a low, steady note that keeps a song from falling apart. That night, alone again in my apartment, I opened my notebook and wrote the final entry. They once told the world I was dead. Now the world knows better, but even if it didn't, I would. I set down the pen and closed the cover with both hands, as if sealing a pulse inside. The basil by the window trembled slightly in the breeze, its scent clean and green and full of continuance. Somewhere below, the baker began kneading dough for the next day's bread. I listened to the rhythm of her hands against the counter and realized that my life, at last, had found its tempo, steady, honest, unafraid. If I could speak to another woman who has been misplaced by her own people, I would tell her this: you are not what they call you, not even what they forget to call you. You are what remains when the paperwork burns and the house changes owners and the air clears. You are what insists. And that insistence, quiet and ordinary as breath, is what keeps the world from closing entirely. They once buried me with words. I resurrected myself with silence, broken at the right moment. Now, every morning when I spread butter on my toast, when I hum to the sparrows, when I say my name to no one in particular, I feel it echo back to me, full and certain. Alive, alive, alive.